right. Thank you again for joining us. And we'd like to begin today's webinar with an opportunity just to pray for the national dialogue for the process, nationally, locally, with the official prayer of the national dialogue. So if you could take a moment to pause, we'll begin our webinar in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Loving God, open us to the beauty of dialogue that allows us to hear with our hearts and speak with our souls. May our conversations ignite your spirit within us to go out into the world as missionary disciples. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So just to recap really quickly on what is the national dialogue and why is it so important in this particular moment. It's a very exciting time in our church, particularly in the United States, but throughout the world, as the church has taken a special focus on young people, youth and young adults. First, through the Ordinary Synod, a few years back, Pope Francis announced that there would be a synod of bishops addressing young people, the faith, and vocational discernment. And so there was a long process to prepare for that synod, the synod that took place itself, and then a lot that's happened since the synod, including the release of the apostolic exhortation Christus Vivit, addressing Pope's message to young people on what he heard from the synod. Hand in hand with that in the United States, there was a process going on called the Fifth Encuentro, and that was an opportunity for the church to listen to the voices of Hispanic, Latino parishioners throughout the United States, not just youth and young adults, but there is a special focus on young people and how does the church help address the needs of Hispanic and Latino youth and young adults in the United States. So a big thing that came out of both of these conversations was just a important stress on how we as church need to be open and listening to the voices of young people so we know how to appropriately respond to their needs. So this opportunity for listening and to accompany young people can be and is being fulfilled through this national dialogue process, which was also going on simultaneously, but at the same time is still taking place in the United States. We're still in a process of listening to the voices of young people and considering what the implications are for our church here in the United States, here in our diocese, in your local parishes and schools, and how we need to address those needs in particular to best serve our young people. The National Dialogue is a partnership through a number of national organizations, including the NFCYM, National Federation for Catholic Youth Ministry, but also the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the National Network of Pastoral Juvenil Hispania, the Catholic Campus Ministry Association. And it's a process that's really unrolled in three phases. The first phase that took place a year ago was a phase of unity, and this was just these organizations reaching out to those in the fields of youth and young adult ministry and letting them know that the national dialogue was taking place. There was also a special emphasis on these two other big things going on, the synod and the encuentro. Then we entered into phase 2, which is engagement, and that's the phase that we're still in right now. And this is that phase where through direct dialogue with young people, we have conversations, listen to the voices of young people, and discern how we will move forward. And that's where phase 3 comes in. At the closing of this calendar year, we'll move into phase 3 with 2020, and the church will begin considering how do we implement what we've heard. And there may be another large gathering of bishops and young people throughout the United States to discuss that a little bit, but there'll also be some big reports that come out of what was heard from the national dialogue throughout the United States, but also we'll get some localized reports based on what we heard here. And that's why it's so important for us to encourage parishes and schools and young people, agencies, and even just groups of friends and young adults to get together to have some conversations and contribute to this national conversation so that their voice is heard in this process, and that we, when we get a localized diocesan report, are accurately hearing the voices of all the young people throughout our diocese and not just the voices of a few. So moving on from the three phases, there's 4 primary groups that participate in these conversations as part of phase 2. Youth, predominantly high school youth, but also middle school youth can participate in conversations. Young adults, so those in their 20s and 30s. Ministry leaders, those of us who are in a position that we work with youth and young adults, and parents of youth and young adults are the 3 primary audiences they want to engage in these conversations. And they can be engaged in conversations separately or together in groups. But the purpose of these conversations is predominantly to more deeply understand the lived experience of youth and young adults, so that we as the church can transform our ministry practice to effectively accompany, encounter the young church, and walk with them accurately according to their needs, and not just what we assume they need most from us in this time. So, as kind of said before, this process is not just the end all be all. It's an opportunity to listen so that we can look at how it transforms us personally in the way we work with youth and young adults, our ministry as a whole, our parish, school, organization, the wider diocese, as well as the nation as a whole, is going to be looking at this, and the USCCB is going to be considering how the bishops need to respond to the voices of young people based on what they've heard through this dialogue. So hopefully those of you who are joining us today or watching the recorded version here may be considering organizing local conversations in your school, in your parish, in your community, broader community or agency. And so we would view you as an organizer. The organizer is someone who would determine where, when, how, with whom conversations will be conducted, as well as, if you're looking at doing this broadly, and hopefully you are, there's going to need to be some element of recruiting and preparing facilitators who help to listen and record the conversations that take place in smaller groups. So your role can be considered in 3 simple steps, really. First step being choose your audience. Second, selecting which questions you want to ask, because there are specific questions, basic questions that go with the national dialogue, but also specific questions that tie into some of the quotes from the synod, and a set of questions that tie into some of the key themes that were heard from the Fifth National Encuentro. So if your young people are aware or engaged in the synod in any way, or you wish to get them more engaged in it, those questions might be right for you. Or if they were engaged in the Encuentro, or you'd like to get them more engaged in the implementation of what was heard at that National Encuentro, those questions might be right for you. And it's for that situation, those questions in particular that have been translated into Spanish, so you can host conversations with parents and other leaders within your church and school communities about where young people are going in light of what was heard in the Encuentro. So after all of that is done and you've hosted the conversation, the third and final step is to fill out a simple online survey that corresponds with the specific questions that you've selected. So we'll take a moment here just to pull up this website and take a look. This is the National Dialogue website, nationaldialogue.info. And that main page that you come to really just has 2 primary links there. You can scroll to the top and there is a menu bar where you can find the conversations in Spanish, a little bit about the Voice and Vision Summit, who we are, forming the National Synod, National Dialogue, how it ties into the Synod and Encuentro, the timeline, etc. But really the things that are here for you are to host a conversation and some additional support and resources around hosting conversations. And we're going to cover a lot of that support in this webinar. So the primary thing that you just need to click on there is how to host a conversation. And like I said, there's 3 simple steps. You choose your audience, non/former and or marginal Catholic youth or young adults is one audience. Another audience would be active or engaged youth or young adults. So if you were hosting this session tied into one of your normal youth nights or an activity that tends to draw more active and engaged youth or young adults, this second set of questions, the second audience is probably the ideal situation for you. In terms of former or marginal Catholic youth and young adults, it may take a little more effort to draw those together, or you may be hosting the conversations in a school setting where you find that the majority of your class may not be, they may identify as Catholic, but they may not be practicing Catholic. And so some of the questions from that audience may be the ideal for you. And if it's a combination thereof, you can consider both sets of questions, and how do you include a little bit of both appropriately with young people who are active and engaged, and those who are a little fallen away and not as practicing. The third audience listed here are parents and families of youth or young adults, and lastly, ministry leaders who work with youth and young adults. And that would be if you wanted to host a session with your adult volunteers and or parish staff, or people within your school, faculty, principals, administrators, to just discuss where you feel young adults are and what the need is there. And we want voices from all of these audiences. So I encourage you to check that out. But step one is choosing the audience that you're going to host that first session with. And from that, like we talked about already, you have 3 sets of questions: basic questions, encuentral questions, synod questions. And it's pretty simple from there just to click on that link and print out a 1 or 2 page sheet that highlights the questions that you will include and your facilitators will ask in guiding the conversations that take place with these young people. So from that step, you'll need to take some time to train your facilitators and be prepared, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. But after finding the questions, you host the conversation, and when that conversation is done, this is where you'll find the corresponding survey: the basic online survey, the Encuentro online survey, the Synod online survey. We'll take a look at this in a little more depth later on, but you'll just click onto that link. It'll guide you to a online survey. It's a Survey Monkey. It's pretty well detailed, step by step, what you need to do, and you just follow those questions to complete that survey. So, your role as an organizer, top 10 tasks and tips. First, identify which of those 4 main audiences you want to host a conversation with, and we talked about that already. Determine potential numbers involved in each category. Decide how you will host these conversations, who will specifically be invited to participate, and then set the dates and locations for those conversations. It may tie into existing class time if you're in a school, or you may schedule something for after school. It may tie into an existing youth night if you're in a parish setting, or you might schedule a special meeting or meetings to have these conversations with young people. Determine how you will follow, inform, or invite people to the conversation. Decide how many facilitators and listeners you feel you'll need based on the audience size. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second, but you want to ideally have people in small groups of about 6, no less than 5, no more than 8. So considering how many you're expecting to come, you should take into account how many facilitators and listeners you will need and recruit them. Then issue your invitations and inform your groups. You can consider forming a hospitality team to help welcome people and really make them feel like this is a safe, welcoming, open space where they can share where they are at without feeling judged, and then conduct your conversations. The conversations really have 3 formats, and we'll just kind of highlight this in the next slide anyway, but there's the introduction, the conversation, and the conclusion. So with this, you see a sample 75-minute time frame. There is a handout posted on our website, columbuscatholic.org/national-dialogue, and we'll bring that up again at the end. But there's a handout that will highlight all these points. And I should have said that up front, but you can find in a simple PDF a lot of the key points from our conversation today, so you don't have to take avid notes. But there's this 75-minute time frame, there's a 60-minute time frame, and then there's a couple others that we'll look at in just a second. But you can find those all detailed in your handout. Part one of that 75-minute time frame is that introduction, and that's the opportunity to welcome people, identify the purpose and goals of the dialogue, orient them to the conversation, lay down some guidelines and rules for respectful dialogue, and open in prayer. From that point, you'll want to form groups. And again, we talked about conversations should ideally be in small groups of about 6 or so participants and one facilitator. So it may take a couple minutes to do that, but the bulk of your time then is spent in the conversation, just opening up with those open-ended questions that they give you. You print out from the site, and then the facilitator will guide through those questions, taking notes on what things really stuck out to them and seem to keep coming up among the young people. And then take some time to conclude by bringing the whole group back together, wrapping up, thanking them for participating, encouraging them that you're going to continue considering what you've heard and how you're going to implement it in your parish or school, and that they will play some role in that. Engage them and encourage them to take ownership in what they shared and how we can transform our ministry, our parish, our school, our diocese, and the national church only with their continued help. That it's not just an opportunity for them to tell us what they want, and then for us as the adults and the organizers to make a change. They need to participate in that active change. And then we close with prayer. So the conversation could be hosted over 2 sessions. This is a 1-session option, 75 minutes or 60. But if you're in a parish and hosting this with folks who are in religious ed, junior high or high school religious education, confirmation prep, or if you're in a Catholic school setting and want to host it during class times, or if you have some sort of conference or retreat or large gathering where you want to host it as like 2 different breakouts or workshop sessions, this 2-session option might be best for you. And so it breaks it down into 2 50-minute sessions. Again, the introduction, forming groups, bulk of the time in the conversation, but you may split up those questions then so that because you only have 30 minutes for conversation. Then some closing comments and prayer, and then you regather people, kind of recap what was covered the first time in terms of the purpose, send them back into those same small groups, and they may want to recap what they talked about the last time, but have concluding conversation around the questions they didn't complete with the first session, closing comments and prayer. This is with the same participants in both sessions. If you happen to have different participants or you want to break them up into different small groups, it would be a very similar layout. You would just need to take time again during that second session to form new groups of 6 or so participants. And again, I'll reiterate, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to type them into the chat, or if you want me to recap on something, we're moving too quickly, just let me know. So be mindful of adaptations that may be needed. Please don't make any changes to the nature, focus, or the key questions of the conversation. You can include some additional questions if you would like to hear some more insight, but it's very important for the national dialogue process to try to glean information from the young people with the questions that are here so that you can provide that information via that survey to the diocese and the greater national conversation that's going to be taking place. But some adaptations to think about is, especially with young adults or parents or adults who are ministers working with minors or young people, one-on-one conversations is definitely a way you can talk out these questions, get some responses, and still fill out the survey. It doesn't have to be in a group of 6. You can sit down with just a couple parents and discuss where they feel they're at and do that a couple times. Also consider cultural groups, and there are questions that are translated into Spanish, as well as some insights on how to appropriately adapt it for other cultural groups on the National Dialogue website. All right, with all that said, are there any questions about coordinating, organizing conversations to take place? Mike will cover in a little more detail the importance, the role of the facilitator and how important it is to prepare your facilitators and who can be facilitators. But I'll take a moment. If anyone has any questions, comments, concerns, something they'd like to recap, you can type that into the group chat now. Otherwise, I will hand it off to Mike, and there'll be another opportunity for some Q&A at the very end.
Okay, Sean, thanks. That was a great overview.
There, Mike.
Sure.
Sorry. Just really quick to talk about the topics of the conversations. And Mike's going to talk a little bit about this as well, so he can tie that in. But I'll come back here. When you select your audience, and this is the same for each audience, I, in this case, selected the non-former and or marginal Catholic youth and young adults. But if you go back to that first page and select active or engaged, parents, ministry leaders, each will bring you to a next page with step 2 and 3 that still breaks down into those 3 categories. So for each audience, there are basic questions that are intended to help guide that conversation. And so that's what you'll find up here. There's questions that tie specifically into the 5th National Encuentro with some quotes from what was heard at that time. And these are available in translation. And then the Synod questions tie in some quotes from the Synod documents. But still, each of these sets of questions are laid out in such a way that we are trying to hear the active, lived experience of young people, whether they're active in their faith or not. What is their lived experience? What's going on in their lives? How do they see the church playing a role in that? How can the church play a greater role in their lives? So for those who are familiar with the pedagogy from Tom Scroom, who talks about catechesis a lot, he emphasizes the importance of faith to life to faith. And so these questions are set up in a similar way, where we'll ask, where is your faith right now? What's going on in your life? And how do you see your faith playing a role in that? And then moving on to how do you see the faith potentially playing a greater role in that? How can the church better address the needs of you and other young people today in the United States? And so it's just an opportunity to listen to the voices of the young people and make sure that we really are accurately taking into account where our young people are and the realities that they face and what they need from the church, and are we giving it to them? So hopefully that helps answer your question a bit. And like I said, Michael, go into a little more detail when we get to preparing the facilitators. All right. Any other questions? Great. Mike, it's all on you.
All right. Thanks, Sean. Great job. Just to add a little bit to what Sean had just said about the topics and your question, Marie, about topics. Each one of those, like Sean said, each one of those questions is geared towards the audience, those that are active or inactive. And so you want to try to get those questions across to young people and record their answers. But also, too, recently, I was working with Kitty Quinn in schools, and we were doing a group with students, Catholic high school students. And there was a point in the conversations where, Kitty felt compelled. There was a question she slipped in, which is fine to do that. If there's something that this is going a certain direction and you feel like you need to slip a question in, and, you can make some minor adjustments there. But at the end of the process, though, you want to make sure that you're getting responses to the questions that are being asked, because that'll go into the database. But again, if there's something that you think could be helpful to ask at that moment and that golden opportunity is there, yeah, feel free to do that. And there might even be a place on the reporting sheet, that Sean showed you in step 3, that you could pass some of that information on as well. Okay, I'm going to talk about facilitation and facilitators, because that's a really, really crucial part of the process. The facilitation can make the experience, it could break the experience, and I don't want to put too much pressure on you. Your job primarily as the organizer is finding good facilitators. You may facilitate a group, which is fine, but your job also is to find good facilitators. So in that process, one thing, and I'll say this up front, this is very, very important. You need folks who facilitate who are good listeners. Listening is absolutely key. The facilitator is going to help spur some of the conversation. The facilitator will ask the questions, and sometimes kind of like, get clarification, and we'll talk about that. But the main thing is you need someone who can listen. Listen and then take their thoughts and ideas and catch those on paper and then pass those on. So those are very important. So first of all, a good facilitator has to know his or her questions well. They've got to study the process, the questions, and they're not all that complicated. You have maybe 4 or 5 questions at most. So they've got to study those questions. They've got to listen more than talk. That's absolutely crucial. And then they've got to be genuinely curious. Like, they've really got to be passionate about this conversation. They've got to really insert themselves in and encourage the conversation, encourage the young people to talk. Again, recently I just did one of these. After the young people got into it, they were really excited. So, but the facilitator has to bring that excitement. They have to communicate, through words and behaviors, again, that they're collaborators in the process, that the process isn't about them. It's not about you, the facilitator. It's about what the young people have to say. And then finally, a good facilitator has to empower the young people to tell their story. This isn't a theological academic discussion. In these questions, if they're really taken to heart, it's really to get at the heart of what young people think and what young people feel about the faith, about their relationship with Jesus. That's what we want. Whatever that truth is, that's what we're getting at. Okay. Next, in terms of choosing facilitators, we got that little image there. That's from, that one's, I just trying to think what movie that's from. That's the
Indiana Jones.
Indiana Jones, yeah, sorry. It takes me a while to think of those things anymore. So anyway, selecting facilitators. First of all, you got to think of the gifts and the qualities that they bring. Not everyone would be a good facilitator. Honestly, we all have different gifts. Not all of our catechists or youth ministers would make good facilitators. So you've got to be judicious and make those decisions. Who would be good to invite to do this? And again, above all of that, a very important point is you want to choose a facilitator who can listen. Another big thing is to train your facilitators. If you go on the website that Sean just took you to a few minutes ago, there's a process on there for training facilitators. It's a little bit lengthy, but if you pick through that process, you can pick the pieces that you think would be important to train your facilitators. And it gives you tips. And some of that I'm going to do, but there's also some additional information on there. So there's a lot of resource information if you use that site on the web page. And on the National Dialogue webpage, you can pull some good information from that.
Oh,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, if I could chime in just really quick then too. On the diocesan site, we have a couple other resources that can be used to train your facilitators. And if you have any questions about those resources or how to use them, or if you'd like some help in training facilitators, you can always reach out to us. But on the note that all teachers and catechists are not suited to be facilitators, we hopefully know our teachers, our catechists, our adult volunteers, and parents well enough to have a sense of who would be good at listening and facilitating, and who may want to talk a bit more and contribute to the conversation. Just because those folks want to talk to and contribute to the conversation doesn't mean that they can't be engaged in this process, though. They may not be ideal for facilitators, but again, we do want conversations to take place with parents and with ministry leaders, volunteers, teachers, catechists. So those individuals would be great people, even if it's just sitting down with them one-on-one to get their voice on the situation, so that they still feel like they have contributed to the process. We want to hear from them as well, but they, you know your folks, you know which ones will be good suited for facilitators and which ones might be better suited for participating in a conversation themselves.
Okay, and I would add just one more thing. Eh, the way this whole process is set up, it's geared towards facilitation by adult, and I think we have to be very aware of that. However, and I'll throw this little caveat in there: um, can young people, like teens themselves, peer facilitate? I wouldn't totally rule that out. However, I would make sure that if a young person, and I'll tell you why I wouldn't rule that out, I'll tell you in a second, but I would make sure that any young person, any teen who would act as a facilitator, that you would have them thoroughly trained. You would mentor them by having them go through the process with you in another venue. Now, the reason I say that I think there would be a situation where young people would be ideal to facilitate. As you notice, one of the categories is we're talking about trying to reach inactive young people. Young people that we don't see in our youth ministries, young people that don't go to church. Um, our young people in our youth ministries, they have access to young people who are inactive, their friends, their peers, their classmates. If you could prepare some, stellar young people who are in who would make good facilitators and have them go into their communities and facilitate a process, gather a group of their friends at their home some Friday night and go through the process and then immediately come back afterwards and share that with you. I think that would be I think that would be a great idea. Now I don't know that that's mentioned anywhere in the materials, but I would suggest that as an option. Again, though, with the caveat that you closely monitor the preparation of the young person who would facilitate a process. Okay, let's talk about the preparation before the conversations. Again, facilitators need to understand, what is the purpose of the dialogue, where this is all going, how this is all going to fit into the big picture of where we are. And Sean did a great job explaining the dialogue and how we got to where we are and all the pieces that fit into it. We've got to prepare our facilitators for their role. They got to know the audience. You got all those multiple audiences to choose from. But the young, whoever the facilitator is, they've got to gear their process to the audience they're with. Certainly, you address this differently with teenagers than you do with peers in ministry, parish staff. Again, the preparation there. So, we have, again, Sean mentioned we have resources on our page. There are resources that are on the national page. So please draw on those resources. Part of preparedness is reading the questions, being thoroughly prepared for the questions that we're going to ask, the conversation that we're going to have. And so you really want to do that. You want to go online and review the questions, copy them off. And then also the survey submittal, that's step 3 on the webpage, the online submittal, the survey. It would be a good idea to go on there and review that. There's actually, when you give the kids responses, or you give the participants responses online, when you type in the information, there's a checklist of things that they ask you to check off on some of those questions. Now, you don't have to answer every question if that's something that you didn't touch, but on that checklist, if you have that in your head or you have that copied out before you go into the conversation, you could kind of have that as your back sheet And if some of these things are talked about, you could check those off. So that would help you to be more prepared as a facilitator, because a very important part of this process is passing this information on to be part of the database for the National Dialogue, because we're all going to work on that. That's very important. Okay. On the day of the conversation, it's really important that, you arrive early, you set up, you create an environment of hospitality, and that you guide the conversations and invite participation. Just a couple quick tips on that for a facilitator. Number one, a facilitator has to manage time. The facilitator has to be aware of the time frame that we're working in. They've got to move the conversation along and know when to switch to questions. A facilitator should also give everyone a chance to share, keeping in mind that not allowing anyone to monopolize the conversation. You know that from being a small group leader, but just to reiterate that, they also don't want to force anyone to share. There may be some questions that might be painful to someone, and that person might not want to share on, so we're not forcing that. We go by the old acronym JAB or jabbing: no judging, no advising, no blaming. This isn't the time for that to happen. It's never the time, really, when we listen to people, to judge or to blame. We need to be comfortable with silence. Sometimes there will be a lull in the conversation. Sometimes it's good to just sit with the silence. So you need to tell your facilitators that. And then you also need to watch for verbal and nonverbal clues, in terms of what they're saying. The nonverbal counts for something like 80 or 90% of the conversation. So you should watch for that and kind of highlight that. Okay, let's go on to after the conversation. What do you do? And Sean went on the page there briefly. Are we going to do that again, Sean? Yeah, okay. Sean's going to show us what the form looks like that you will fill in what the facilitator will fill in for their group after the conversation is done. If you have like 5 groups that are going at one time during your youth group session, each facilitator, we're going to ask them to go online and to complete this process. Okay. All right. Sean, you want to pull that up there?
So you'll want to give the facilitators the link to the questions that are specific, or the survey that's specific to the questions you select. But from that link, they'll go on and read through these instructions carefully. The questions are fairly easy. They're direct, based on what the questions were asked during the conversations that took place. But there are a few additional questions, and that's why it's helpful for the facilitators to look through it in advance and be prepared, so that they make notation of everything that they need before coming to the site. It's not timed, but it's just helpful, I think, to be prepared on what they're going to need to fill out. And they should then share what they heard with you as the organizer of the conversations, but it shouldn't fall to you as the organizer to fill out the survey for each of those small groups. And it should be filled out for each small group conversation, not just once for the whole parish if there were 6 different conversations that took place with young people. So the primary questions that are required are what diocese you're from, Diocese of Columbus, right at the top middle there. They can put in their email address. We're in the Northeast part of the country. You'll put parish, school, diocese, campus, movement, regional conference or events, other, if it's a youth serving agency. So how many people were part of the conversation? And this, again, should be specific to your group, that if you're a facilitator or your facilitators group, that they were in charge of facilitating. So ideally 6, somewhere between 5 and 8 folks, specific to that group. Were they all female, male, mostly female, male, half and half? What was the general ethnicities present? And you can check more than one box here. Language it was conducted, age group, you facilitated the conversation mostly with engaged youth. From there, you'll actually get into questions that correspond with the basic questions that were asked. But again, there's these check boxes here based on some things they anticipate you to hear from. There's still areas where you kind of fill in what were some key things that you heard, but also these check boxes. And that's where it becomes helpful to just take a glance at the survey. You'll need to check off those required fields to move on to the next couple pages, but you don't have to click submit. It won't collect that data until you click submit. So you can take a glance at these questions in advance, know as a facilitator what they're going to be asking, and be prepared to come back and fill this out as you're taking notes in the conversation that you're hearing. And so with each of these, there's 3 pages total, and then you'd click done when you're all finished, and it'll submit those responses to the national conversation. From the national conversation, they're going to look at which ones came specifically from the Diocese of Columbus, and we'll get a localized report after the fact from those voices throughout our diocese.
Okay, and we'll share that information with you. The information that we get at some point, we'll compile it, we'll put it in a report, and we'll share it. And that's where it's really going to be helpful to all of us to get a little more insight into what young people are thinking about the church, especially in the Diocese of Columbus. And I would just add one more thing. I'm going to do a couple helpful tips yet, but just one more thing. Don't feel that you have to alter or doctor or change their responses. I mean, if there's some gut punching response that that you get from your group, if it's difficult to swallow, our goal, your goal as facilitator, is to record what young people say. Our goal isn't to change it or alter it, and I know you won't do that, but I'm just saying to your facilitators, their goal is to let's catch what young people have to say. Let's deal with the truth, and whatever that truth is or whatever their perceptions are. That's very important that we catch their perceptions. We catch what they're thinking and feeling. Okay, let's go just a couple really quick helpful tips. Number one, and I'll just do these really quickly because we've kind of covered some of this. Number one is stay focused on accompaniment. Again, know why we're having the conversations. What this is an encounter. It's an encounter in love. This is an opportunity to share our feelings and our thoughts and some very important things. So this is accompaniment. So stay focused on that. Our goal is to try to understand. Goal 2 is be empathetic. Empathetic listening is very much about trying to be with somebody as opposed to talking to someone. It's about listening. It's about trying to understand where one's feelings are, to put aside our own prejudices and biases, and at that moment that need to advise or help, but to sit and to listen and to be with the person. That's what empathetic listening is about. And a very important part of that is don't switch hats. Tell your facilitators, don't try to jump into, they hear something that a young person says, and that's a contradiction to church teaching. That's not a good thing. Your goal isn't right there to jump on that and correct it. That is not your goal as a facilitator. Your goal is to listen. I think through this process and through all of this is an incredible opportunity to evangelize. But for this particular process, the evangelization is in the listening. It's not in the teaching. It's in the listening to allow young people to express their feelings and thoughts and where they are with the faith. And then finally, stay curious. Stay curious. We got the Dos Equis guy there. Stay focused on what we're trying to understand. Stay focused on the topic. And also, this is the opportunity to, ask clarifying questions. If a young person says something and you want them to explore more, just say, how'd that make you feel? Or tell me more. This is the opportunity to invite. And if your facilitator is really in the conversation, really empathetically listening and with that young person and those young people, then you'll invite. You'll want to learn more. We want to learn what they have to say. Okay. And then, young people, they want to be understood, so we listen to understand. And I just talked a little bit about that, you know, body language, and so those are important facilitation skills. We've got to really tweak that in our facilitators and make sure that they're using those kinds of skills to conduct these conversations. And then finally, in closing out a conversation, you always want to thank the young people. You want to thank them for their responses. Um, you want to, you can invite them and say to them, if you really enjoyed this, come back and we'll talk some more. Like I started my little presentation here on facilitation, talking about the Catholic high school students that we met with. There were about a dozen of them or 10 of them recently. This was just like a few weeks ago. When the conversation ended, we listened, we let them talk. We said very little other than to provide some clarification around the question. When it was all over, they were energized and excited. They wanted to talk more. They said, yeah, can we do this again? Can we bring our friends who have different opinions and bring them? So, the follow-up is very important. Okay. And then finally, yeah, and again, make sure at the very end, you collect all the content of the conversations, you go online, you submit it. If you follow some of those tips that we gave you, then, you can submit that and just fill in the boxes. And again, it's going to be part of our bigger picture. Okay, I think that's takes us to any final questions. Any, if you want to write in the chat box any questions you have, and Sean and I will do our best to
One
give you
thing
some
I'll
responses.
bring up while we're waiting for any closing questions, thoughts, ideas, even if you have some suggestions on how that have come to mind on how this can be implemented locally. I'll just bring up our site really quick, the columbuscatholic.org/national-dialogue. This will change up top here with the closing of this webinar. We will put a recorded version of the webinar up toward the top here for people. And as I talked about, a lot of the key points from the webinar, we won't share the slides because a lot of the key concepts and points can be found in this handout from the instructional webinar. It's a PDF that has, what is the purpose? What is your role as organizer, recording facilitators, formats of the conversations, 60 minutes, 2 sessions, the role of the facilitator, tips for facilitating and training facilitators. That can all be found on this site. As well as this is not specific to the National Dialogue, but this is a guide for a listening session with young people that can be used with young people or even just with adults, but as a useful tool to train facilitators. It's got a little prayer and icebreaker, an overview on laying the ground rules for discussion, but then some guiding thoughts that help people discuss why is it so important to listen and what is Christian listening and accompaniment and what it is not. So this would be a helpful tool if you're training youth facilitators or even adult facilitators to do a little process with them. That's just a sample listening session and give them the opportunity to practice being a facilitator before you send them off with the National Dialogue questions specifically. There's a brief description of the dialogue and process there, as well as the detailed facilitating guide that Mike was talking about from the National Dialogue site. But it's from 2018. And it's a little longer. So I think there's some useful tips in there, but be mindful that the process, especially on the website, how you record and enter in that data has changed a little bit since phase 1 when they developed this facilitating guide. So if you have any questions, let us know. But those are kind of the key resources that we pulled over from the National Dialogue website. You can go to the National Dialogue website from here. And like I pointed out earlier, the host the conversation piece has those, 3 steps on how to facilitate the conversation. Pick your audience, pick your questions, submit your questions. But as Mike was saying, there's that additional support for conversations here. certainly feel free to check this out. But like I said, we pulled a lot of the stuff so that you're not too overwhelmed by all these resources here. We pulled most of those key resources and just put a couple documents that we felt were most important at the bottom of our webpage here. So if you have questions about training facilitators or wanting to review with the facilitators or at the session itself, what is the purpose of the National Dialogue, you can find that right here. The dialogue site would be the helpful resource for selecting your questions and submitting your questions. So first question that I see here has to do with, will we use formats to fill the results of the conversation during the meeting? So the format or form is online. You can find it on that National Dialogue website, and we can post copies of blank ones if you would find that helpful, or if you'd like us to send them to you via email, you can check that out. But once you select your audience here and your questions, these are the guiding questions that will be used during the conversations, which is the broader part of that format. And then going back to our site, in that handout that covers the key points from today, you can find on here formats for the conversations, all of which should include an introduction, the conversation, which will use those guiding questions, and a conclusion. But there's an example 75-minute time frame with much more detail than what we went into of how that time breaks out, a 60-minute time frame, and 2 examples of breaking that up into 2 separate sessions, outline A and B. So from there, you can kind of just fill in the blanks in terms of giving the facilitators the conversation questions that will be used during that bulk middle section of the time. And then you as the organizer would definitely need to be prepared for that first introduction, explaining to people what the purpose of this is, laying down some ground rules, praying together, and then forming people into groups, then bringing them all back together, thanking them for coming, encouraging them to continue to be part of the conversation and the implementation, and then closing in prayer before sending people off.
Just to add to that quickly, one thing you can do, the facilitator typically, it's easy enough. The facilitator's listening. The facilitator can take the notes, and you have the questions in front of you. There's space there. You can record their responses. But if you really want to, you could have a second person sitting in who would act as a recorder, and that person could take the notes and then free the facilitator up to, facilitate and the recorder could also act as a second set of ears to make sure you capture everything. You could do that as well.
Any last questions? All right. So as we brought up earlier, there's a last slide here before we close out. But as we brought up earlier, if any questions come to mind, if you would like some help in preparing facilitators, organizing the conversation locally, ideas or tips about who to host conversations with in your area, at any point in time, you can reach out to Mike or I at the Office of Youth and Young Adult Ministry via phone or email, can be found on the diocesan website. But last but not least, the most important step for preparation is that we ask you to pray for this process. Whether you've decided to organize conversations locally yourself, or you feel like you may not be able to, we encourage you and ask you to encourage others to pray for all those involved with the National Dialogue, for youth, young adults, their families. We will be praying for all of you as organizers and facilitators. Pray for the people who will gather in your conversation. Pray for the church leadership locally and globally as we move forward from these conversations, and from the Synod and Encuentro as well. So that's all that we have for today. I thank you all for joining us and for watching the recorded webinar on our site. And we will continue to pray for you. I hope you pray for us as well.
God bless everyone.